Hello everyone, welcome to Raaonline lecture series on neurophysiology. This session will be seeing about motor tracts or descending tracts. The specific learning objectives of this session will be, we'll be seeing about the organization of the motor system, we'll be seeing about what is UMN and LMN, that is upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, and the different tracts involved in the motor control, namely pyramidal tracts and the extrapyramidal tracts, and about the motor homunculus. Then and there we'll be seeing about certain applied physiological concepts. Organization of the motor system involves planning and execution. Okay, so the plan for any motor activity, it started in the cortical association areas, and the basal ganglia and the lateral part of the cerebellum helps in a great deal for planning. Now this idea, this plan is given to the premotor cortex and the motor cortex for execution. Okay, and the premotor cortex and the motor cortex also directly receives information from the basal ganglia and the lateral cerebellum. Now after this plan has been made and given to the premotor cortex, it is its role to execute it. So the motor cortex executes this plan through different descending tracts of fibers, which are chiefly corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts, as well as the extrapyramidal tracts. Okay, so corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts forms a pyramidal tract, as well as extrapyramidal tracts are there, which controls the posture of the body. Right. So this movement, after it has been executed, a feedback will be sent to the intermediate cerebellum. Now this cerebellum has to compare the plan with the performance, and if there is any discrepancy, the cerebellum on the go of the movement, it will correct the errors. Okay, and the error copy will also be sent to the premotor cortex. So this is how the motor system is organized for execution of a particular movement of the body. These are the terms to be pondered. What is a pyramidal system? What is an extrapyramidal system? What is upper motor neuron and what is lower motor neuron? Think about this, we will be discussing this in coming slides. So what are the descending tracts or motor tracts? The pyramidal tracts and the extrapyramidal tracts are the descending tracts. The pyramidal tracts includes corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts, whereas the extrapyramidal tracts includes tectospinal, reticulospinal, rubrospinal, vestibulospinal. You can see in all these names, the first half of the name denotes the origin, the second half of the name denotes its termination. For example, corticospinal tract means the tract originates in the cortex and ends in the spinal cord. Rubrospinal tract means the tract originates in the red nucleus, ends in the spinal cord. Okay, so this is how we have to decipher the meaning of the words. Let us see about the corticospinal and the corticobulbar system in detail. This is the longest tract. It originates in the cerebral cortex, runs all the way almost up to the half of the spinal cord. Okay, and the speciality about this is, this tract is present only in the higher animals, including human beings. All the voluntary skilled motor activities with a precise control is possible only in the higher animals and human beings. Okay, it is not present in the lower animals. So the corticospinal tracts includes the nerve fibers that pass from the motor cortex to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, and they are responsible for the voluntary movements of the trunk and limb muscles, especially the fine, precise voluntary movements. Corticobulbar tracts includes the nerve fibers that pass from the motor cortex to the cranial nerve nuclei, which are present in the brainstem, that is the midbrain, pons and medulla. From these brainstem areas, they go to the respective head and neck region for its supply, and they are also responsible for the voluntary movements of head and neck. Let us see about the corticospinal tracts. Again, it is classified into lateral corticospinal tract and the ventral or anterior corticospinal tract. The origin for this corticospinal tract arises from the three main parts. One is the motor cortex, that is area 4. So this is the motor cortex. This is the area 4. Area 4. Okay. So it is just anterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so that is area 4 or motor cortex, where it receives 30% of the fibers. Then is the premotor cortex or area 6. So this is the area 6. This is just anterior to the primary motor cortex. Okay, and this also includes 6A, that is the supplementary motor area, which is actually just neighbor to the premotor cortex. Okay, area 6 and area 6A. This also contributes about 30% of corticospinal fibers. But the majority of the corticospinal fibers, they get its contribution from the somatosensory area, that is area 312, 40% almost. Okay, so this is the major share for the origin of corticospinal tract fibers. 97% of the fibers, they have small diameter and they conduct very slowly. Okay, and these fibers, they originate from the layer 4 of the motor cortex. Only 2 to 4% of the fibers, they originate from the layer 5, where they have the giant pyramidal cells of beds, and that have the large diameters. They have rapidly conducting fibers. So this is in a nutshell, this is the picture of descending tracts, both the lateral and the anterior corticospinal pathway. Okay, you can see here the origin comes from the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. Okay, from there it actually spreads over a fan like area. The fibers spreads and they enter into the internal capsule, the anterior 2/3 of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. From there it enters the midbrain. Okay, and from the midbrain, in the middle 1, 2, 3/5 of the midbrain it enters. From there it enters into the pons. Okay, and in the pons they get scattered, and from the pons, from the lower end of the pons, once again it gets bundled up and they enter into the medulla. Okay, so in the medulla they get crossed. 85% of the fibers, they get crossed. This is called as motor decussation. Okay, so they get crossed to the opposite side and they end in the lateral corticospinal tract, in the spinal cord, in the lateral white columns. Okay, from there, from the lateral white columns, they go and synapse over the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord in the anterior grey horn. Okay, so this is about the termination of the lateral corticospinal pathway. Whereas the anterior corticospinal pathway, again the origin is the same. It arises from the primary motor cortex and crosses the internal capsule and then goes to the midbrain in the crus cerebri, goes to the pons and they get scattered here, and then from the pons it enters the medulla, where they are not crossing here. Instead, they are continuing in the same direction and goes to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, before termination, it gets crossed to the opposite side. So, the 80% of the fibers, they cross to the opposite side and they form the lateral corticospinal pathway. This is 80%. Okay, whereas 20% of the fibers, they does not cross in the medulla and they travel in the same direction. They get crossed only at the level of insertion or termination in the anterior grey horns. Okay, so this forms the 20% of the cells. This lateral corticospinal tract, they supply the muscles in the distal parts of the limbs, whereas the anterior corticospinal tract supplies the proximal parts of the limbs.